Good morning everyone and welcome to our weekly webinar series. My name is Andrea Davis. I am the International Programme Manager at the Civil Service College, and I am joined by our expert trainer here this morning, Clair Fisher. Good morning, Claire. Hello. This is Claire's third time now, isn't it, Claire, that you've joined us on one of our webinars? And we're very happy to have her here this morning with us. Claire will be delivering the session, of course, on evidence-based policy making, the myth of future proofing. And the session will last up to around 1 hour. As mentioned again, which I've already said a few times, please feel free to use the Q&A box. Use the chat box just to raise comments, any points, questions, and so on. And Claire will be will happily answer all of your questions throughout. If there are any technical glitches this morning, any issues with audio, please just put your comments in the chat box just to let us know. That would be fantastic. Okay, Claire, could you just move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so the Civil Service College, our UK footprint, who are we? Where are we? We are an independent training organisation that offers training solutions to the UK civil service and the wider public sector. We have delivered training to not just central government departments, such as the Cabinet Office, DEFRA and DWP, but also devolved administrations like the Welsh Government and, of course, our NHS, as well as local authorities. Okay, thank you, Claire. Not only do we work in the UK, we of course work around the world as well. So a big hello to any of our internationals that have joined us this morning. We do actually have trainers that can fly out to your country, obviously when travel permits. And we do offer training here in London. We are based in Westminster, so right in the heart of Whitehall. So when travel is allowed, please do come and join us in our classroom. We would be happy to see you. Okay, thanks, Claire. Okay, so our course categories and services. We offer around about 70 different types of courses, ranging from accountability and governance to leadership and management, professional development, policy, law and legal, media, digital and data, and finance and commercial. This particular webinar falls under the policy series. So if you are interested in finding out any more information about this particular webinar, any other webinars that we run or training sessions, full day and half day, please do speak to Claire at the very end. You can contact me. I will put my information in the chat box so you can ask us any questions. We'd be happy to provide you more information on any of the topics that I run today. Thank you, Claire. Okay, so again, we have Claire here, third time with us. A big hello again to you, Claire. Clair Fisher is, she's worked with the college for many years now, and she mainly delivers, training under the policy series. But today, this particular webinar is based on evidence-based policy making, the myth of future proofing. In this session, Claire will debunk the myth of future proofing and explore how those of us who work in public policy, actually need to find ways of being comfortable working in a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous environment. So Claire, welcome. Again, I'd love for you to make a start, if that's all right with you.
Hello, thank you so much, Andrea.
You.
Welcome, everybody. Nice to be with you again. So as Andrea said, my background is UK civil service. I worked for a number of years in central Whitehall and then also as part of our regional government structure, which is probably a little bit more relevant background for the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, because I've worked as part of the UK regional resilience structure. So I've worked on a lot of our regional resilience planning, emergency responses. I've helped be a part of and run lots of the UK preparedness exercises, is what we used to call them. We used to prepare for flu and fire and flood and so on. And I've also been part of the UK government team that has dealt with previous emergencies, including previous flu issues, flooding a while ago now, but we had foot and mouth in this country. We had fuel strikes and also some flooding issues. So I've worked kind of as part of the structures that deal with emergency responses, and that's something that I think we will be talking about today. It's a really interesting day, I think, to be thinking about the future. You join us, I know we've got international people on the call, but you join us today on the first day of our second English lockdown. I'm going to try and avoid talking about COVID too much because I think we're all a little bit overwhelmed, but it is inevitably the sort of the backdrop and the current context, and probably the reason why many of you are here. And we've certainly heard in recent weeks and months people say things like, we haven't got a crystal ball, this is unprecedented, this is unexpected. But yeah, I'm very much aware that as policymakers in the public sector, we are sort of expected to do all those things. We are sort of expected to have a crystal ball, to be able to plan, to be able to prepare. And there's a phrase that we've taken as the title for today's webinar, which has always bothered me, if I'm honest, when I'm asked to future-proof something, or whether you produce a strategy and you're asked, is it future-proof, or what can we do to future-proof it? And so today, I think what I want to do is explore a little bit more about why that phrase bothers me so much, and maybe where we can get to a slightly more realistic understanding of what is possible in terms of public policy when we think about the future, what our attitude and our role is towards the future. But kind of by way of a gentle introduction, again, if you are in the UK and you are avid followers of the BBC series Bake Off, you will know that this week it was 80s week on Bake Off, and there was this kind of throwback to the 1980s. Now, I am a child of the 1980s, and I think when we're looking at the future, it's often interesting to kind of cast our minds back a little bit to think, where have we come from? What were our expectations like about where we are now? I'm sure nobody would expect us to be quite where we are now, but thinking about where we've come from, what are the changes that I've seen in that time? I think we always think about tech changes. So, you know, I grew up as a teenager with no mobile phone, with no internet connection, with no email. And I worked, my first Saturday job, I worked with a card reader, a card machine, and I've had to try and explain tech like cassette tapes in cars and card readers and so on to my children. And I think when we think about change in the future, we often think about technological change. But actually, it's the sort of societal change, the culture change that's often the bigger, more different things. So again, in my lifetime, I've seen things like ban on smoking, the wearing of seatbelts in cars. It was only in the 1980s that smoking on aeroplanes was banned, and that just feels completely unthinkable to us now. There was also, in my childhood, there was a real culture against breastfeeding babies. It was all very much a bottle was best at that time. And also the idea that using frozen meals was the kind of ultimate in women's liberation. So most children of the 80s weren't used to home cooked meals in the way that we are now. So these kind of cultural changes are actually the ones that are often the most significant, and the long-term changes that we're starting to see now in terms of recycling and climate change and so on as well. Other big changes I've been thinking about in preparing for this, we've had a lot of devolution in the UK, complete change in the way that our constitution and our power structures are organised. And then on very practical levels, we've seen legislation introducing stuff like disabled rights, more equality stuff, and child maintenance as well, the paying maintenance for children. So these kind of quite cultural changes are actually the ones that I think are most significant. So something that I want to be thinking about today is actually the future as we look at it is not this linear thing. It doesn't follow one thing to the next, which is often why it feels so unpredictable. And often the kind of things that we are trying to think about predicting, like tech changes, are often maybe little red herrings for some of the more significant longer term cultural changes where the real challenges arise. And of course, COVID teaches us very well, doesn't it, that it's the big, we call these disruptive events that really derail everything else. So the future is not entirely unexpected or unprecedented, but it certainly provides us with some challenges as public sector leaders. So in this morning's session, I'm going to kind of cover these following points. I want us to think about the public policy approach to thinking about the future. How should we think about the future as people involved in public policy and public sector work? I want to bust some myths about that. Like I say, this phrase, future proofing, has bugged me and bothered me for most of my career. And I want to just talk a little bit about how the use of that phrase actually, I think, signals quite a deep misunderstanding about our role that can cause lots of problems. We know more than we think we know about the future. So we're going to have a look at what do we know, and I'm going to signpost you to some really excellent resources out there if you are in the business of trying to predict the future in public policy. But we still mess up. So we're going to think about why we still fail, even though we know so much stuff. And we'll try and wrap up with a little bit of a think about a way forward. So as Andrea said, I'm more than happy. We've got the chat box, you've got the question Q&A. As things occur to you as I'm speaking, feel free just to use the chat to ask me some questions, and I will try and deal with stuff as we go along. It makes it a lot more interesting and interactive that way.
It does, yeah.
But I will also leave a good 10-15 minutes at the end, so we can kind of tackle anything else. So let's kind of dive into the kind of content, move on from my preamble, and think about, well, what does a public policy approach to thinking about the future mean? Some of you who have been involved in either my policy training courses or the previous policy webinars will be familiar with this little diagram. This is the UK Treasury model. It talks about the different functions of the public sector, and we talk about the strategic function being the bit that is concerned with looking ahead to the future, the vision bit of the organisation. And when we talk about public sector policy, one of my favourite authors on this subject is Sean Lusk. We've got a whole lot of references on the final slide, so you can look these all up later on. He talks about the role of public sector strategy is reimagining the future. And I think this is so exciting. So Sean Lusk talks about how the private sector tries to predict the future so it can take advantage of it and make money from it, frankly. But in the public sector, we're involved in something a little bit more challenging, but also more exciting. We are involved in reimagining the future, reshaping the future. Patrick Dixon, this is also in the references later on, says either you see the future as something to prepare for or as a world to shape by your own actions. And for me, the business of the public sector is about shaping the future. It's not just about trying to predict it, but about trying to kind of get ahead, trying to be involved in changing. And certainly in the UK policy framework, the rationale for involvement in public policy is that we want to change something in the future. So this is a really ambitious, actually, way of thinking about the future. It casts us as policymakers, not as victims of a future that's kind of coming at us, but as something that we want to be actively, optimistically involved in, so that we can create a future that is better because we have been involved than it otherwise would be. And again, Patrick Dixon encourages us to take hold of the future, so otherwise the future will take hold of you. So I want to start by framing this about the reason we're interested in the future is because we want to make it better, because we want to be involved in protecting and kind of optimizing life for citizens, not because we're thinking about the profit motive. And I think this really changes the way that we think about the future. So when we look ahead, ahead at the future, what do we see? We often feel overwhelmed, I think. And if you're asked, what does the future hold? The glib response often is, well, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know. But the truth is actually that the long-term trends are very, very predictable. And again, I've referenced it. I'm going to wave it. You'll gather I'm a fan of books. This book by Patrick Dixon is in the references at the end. It's brilliant, actually. And it was written about 8 years ago. And he sets out long-term trends that he says are very, very predictable. And so many things in there are absolutely bang on. So, increased concern about the environment, mistrust of politicians, migrations from poor countries to richer countries. There's a whole list of them. And he makes the point that long-term trends are actually very predictable. But the change in trends is often slower than we think. Excuse me. So we expect change to be sudden, but often we don't notice it because it's kind of slower than we think. It's kind of incremental. But where we get derailed is because trends intersect with each other. There's a kind of complexity about how these things interrelate, and we get disrupted by what he calls wild card events. Something happens that kind of blows all our planning off the scale. And I think part of the problem about the future is often we don't think or look quite far enough ahead, because the very long-term trends are some of the most significant. So again, when we're thinking about our public policy response to the future, we need to think just how far ahead are we looking? Oops, excuse me, my slides have gone slightly crazy. There we go. Back onto our little diagram there about the public sector. That pointy bit, the academic term for the pointy bit in that diagram is the strategic apex, which is academic jargon for how far ahead are you looking? And I think my experience is most public sector organisations at the moment are struggling to look 6 months ahead. We're struggling with the day-to-day. We're struggling to look more than just a few weeks or months ahead. Actually, the minimum most public sector organisations should be looking at is 5 years. Most of us have 3-year budget cycles, but that 3 to 5 years should be the minimum that our strategic planning takes into account. But actually, it's really only kind of when you start looking 5 or 10 years ahead that you start to be able to see significant trends and you start to be able to get ahead of them. So the question, how far ahead should public policy be looking for, I think is one that's really important and changes the scale of how we think about the future. I've done some work with the departments in the UK looking at climate change. Their strategic horizon is 500 years. Their strategic planning goes ahead to 500 years, which is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And I think when we start to unpack what goes wrong with strategic planning, I think it is the scale actually of where we look at. And what about risk? So in the UK system, risk and uncertainty are literally the same thing. Okay, and I think this really helps us understand how we think about the future. So as we look further into the future, things become more uncertain, fairly obvious. And this little diagram is taken from the Treasury Guidance on Risk Management, and it explains to us how there are different appropriate attitudes to risk at different levels in the organisation. So when we're thinking into the future, when we're looking 5, 10, 500 years into the future, things become massively uncertain. And so we should have an attitude to risk that holds that. And I think one of the things that goes wrong, despite the fact that this diagram is in all of our guidance, is we expect that we should be able to reduce all risk down as low as possible. But what you can see there on the Treasury diagram is that in the now, when you're delivering stuff in the now, you can reduce risk down to 0. When you look further ahead, we have to hold the idea that things are more uncertain and more risky. One of the things I did as a senior civil servant in the UK was do interviews for senior civil service. And one of the real kind of differentiating questions we used to ask was about people's attitude to risk. if they understood that things were uncertain and that they couldn't future-proof things, and they would have to find a way of holding this level of uncertainty, then we felt that they would be able to manage and perform at that strategic level. If they thought they could manage all the risk down to zero by sheer hard work or intelligence, we knew that this person probably wouldn't do very well. So let me just talk, go back slightly and talk about some of these long-term trends, and then we'll get into some of this myth busting. So Patrick Dixon talks about the 6 phases of the future. These things are the long-term trends. So when we talk about things being unpredictable, actually these are the things I think we can predict. He talks about the future becoming increasingly fast. So the speed of change, the fact that disruptors will come up and derail what we're doing. Urban, we've seen this globally, you know, increasingly we'll be looking at city-based populations, increasingly dense populations. And so all the kind of challenges about how resources are distributed and utilized become really quite significant. He talks about a trend of tribalism, which I think we've seen. So people become not just nationalist, but tribal. So kind of very loyal to specific groups, and those groups becoming increasingly connected and vocal. And again, let's try and avoid talking about the other main issue of the day, which is the US election. We can see in our politics, we are becoming increasingly tribal. And on the other side of that, there's a trend for universalism, so globalization. And I think this is really interesting for those of us working in public policy, because we've got tribalism kind of pulling in one way and universalism pulling in another way, which leaves a really interesting question actually about the role of the nation state and the role of those of us working in the democratic institutions. Where do we fit? What is our role in this future? This is not a surprise, the kind of slight shaking of the role of the nation state as they are pulled kind of by tribal cliques formed outside of nations and also global structures is a trend that we've seen been coming for at least the last decades, yet we do still seem to be surprised by it. When Patrick Dixon talks about radicalism, he talks about the death of traditional politics, the rise of radical activism, including things like sustainability, climate change. He's writing before Greta Thunberg, but actually when you read what he writes about radicalism, it's this global radical movement separate from nation states and traditional democracies that has an ethical element as well. So the values and the motivation becomes increasingly ethically driven and less profit driven. So all these things we know are happening. So we know quite a lot about the face of the future. And as a public policy, we need to think, what is our response to them? So let's think about some of those myths. What are the myths that really I think I've noticed that pervade? If you've noticed other things, pop them into the chat box. The future is 5G, IoT, AI, for tech-based. And actually, I'm going to talk about the UK Foresight team in a moment. They've done a brilliant paper on what AI means for policymakers. So if you haven't read that, thank you there for the reminder. We've got that on there. So what are these myths that kind of I think I've identified within our system? So for me, one of the big ones, and they're obviously wrong when you think about it, but there is this idea that it's as if people think we can know and predict the future. Okay, so the way that the politicians will talk, the way that the opposition will challenge, I know at the moment Boris Johnson has his favourite epithet for the leader of our opposition is Captain Hindsight, which he uses as a criticism, because there is this kind of idea that pervades everything, that we can know and accurately predict the future, when actually the reality is, as we've described, the future is uncertain and unpredictable. And kind of sitting with that truth, however self-evident it is, I think is something that public policymakers need to be able to do. There's also a myth that more data will guarantee more certainty. That the reason we don't know is because we haven't got enough data, we haven't got enough information, or we haven't processed it properly. And I think that the truth is that data can inform a lot about trends, and we'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about what we do know, but it's not perfect. It can't ever give us a perfect, guaranteed, certain answer. We've seen this, oh my goodness, we've seen this in recent months, haven't we? This idea that evidence is one thing. We've talked about being led by the science, guided by the evidence, as if the evidence is one unified, perfect thing. When actually the reality is that policy making is complex, and we've covered this in some of our other webinars, and expert opinion is often divided or partial. Anyone that's sat in a room full of experts, a lot of my work in the civil service was sitting with a range of experts, arguing, debating, deciding what is the right thing to do, because the right thing for the environmentalists was not the right thing for the housing providers, was not the right thing for the infrastructure providers, was not the right thing for the highways agency. I've done a lot of work on housing development and infrastructure growth, and trying to work out where to put houses and how to provide the services and how to protect the environment. You sit in those meetings and you realize there isn't one thing that is the right answer. There's a whole set of evidence, and as public policy workers, that's what we do. We sit and we balance and we discuss. Policymaking is complex, and the idea that there is this one perfect set of evidence is very much in my myth-busting hit list. And what follows from that is, I think often as policymakers, we feel like what we're being asked to do is come up with a perfect bulletproof solution. Certainly, I feel I've been in that position. What should we do? Is it future-proof? Is this the right answer? These are the kind of questions that will get fired at you when you're working in the policy space under pressure. And it feels sometimes if we can't deliver the perfect bulletproof solution, we failed. We're not good enough, we're not clever enough, the private sector could do it better. Actually, I think that's quite a dangerous way of thinking. I think we need to be realistic to understand that solutions are only ever best fit. They're always going to involve trade-offs, there's always a compromise, there's always going to be future iterations of things. This is the reality of working in public policy. And again, I've worked with hundreds of civil servants now, and often people feel that they're struggling with their job because they're misunderstanding what's being asked of them, or they are being asked to do unrealistic things. And so part of this is a reassurance that it is not possible to come up with a perfect bulletproof solution in public policy. Things will always involve trade-offs and compromise. You're only ever going to be able to live the best thing for now and then have to come back to it and change it and iterate and move on. So our expectations, I think, need to change, and the way we judge ourselves, frankly, maybe need to change a little bit. Now, here's a biggie. We think we'll find time for strategic planning another day. We're too busy today, so we'll do our strategic planning tomorrow or next week or on our away day. Okay, we sort of park this activity that we know is important, this strategic planning, this thinking about the future. We know we need to do it, but we're going to do it tomorrow because today is just too busy. And the sooner we realize that that's just a lie, the better, because the now will always absorb your time and your attention without deliberate, careful action. I've been doing a lot of work in recent months running strategic thinking training and strategic thinking workshops within the UK government, because we need to make space for this. We need to make deliberate effort and attempts to carve out time to do strategic planning. It won't happen tomorrow. There is never time tomorrow. The now always just absorbs everything that we will do. And then there's a myth that we can do it all, that there are 6 priorities and we will do them all. And again, if you've ever had a conversation with a politician, and often this is what we're doing in the policy space, isn't it, is trying to match the capacity for the work that we have with the level of priorities that the politicians have. I've been in that position when a minister has asked me to do something new, and we've said, well, that's great. Which of the 3 other things that we're working on would you like me to drop so that we can do this new thing? And there is this pressure to do it all. But actually, I think it's really important that we see political bandwidth is a really real constraint. So not just political bandwidth, but actual capacity within the services. So the need to prioritize becomes really, really important. I'm just going to pause for a moment because I'd be really interested to know if you could use the chat to maybe respond. Does this feel like the environment that you're working in? Do you feel a little bit like the people around you, and maybe even you to an extent, have kind of been sold, I would call it a lie, that we are operating in this myth space?
Yeah, we've already got
Thank
someone
you.
saying absolutely
Yeah,
nail on the
right,
head.
okay. So it feels like we're being asked to work in this myth space, and I think step 1, it's a bit like a kind of any good addiction program, isn't it? Step 1 is acknowledging that we've got a problem, actually, and saying these are unrealistic expectations. Are you seriously saying that I need to be able to accurately predict the future? Are you seriously saying that my capacity is infinite and I need to be able to do everything that is asked of me? When we call them out, I think then we realize that they are obviously false. The problem is we very rarely take a step back and notice these things, because we're so busy rushing after the next thing and the next thing and the next thing that we don't take the time to notice that.
Yeah, I've got a few comments here. Absolutely recognise this. Lifting the myths is refreshing and removes a burden. Yes, especially on the data. Most of us think the more data, the better, but don't know how to filter out the noise. Strategic planning always tomorrow. So yeah,
lovely. Okay, so you're with me, you're in my tribe.
we are.
So
together as one.
Step 1 is let's kind of be truth tellers into this culture. Stand up, and call it out. If somebody's asking you to future proof something, you'll say, hang on a minute, are you actually asking me to accurately predict the future here? Because you do realize that's impossible, and I will do my best, but okay. So there's something here about how we need to just change the culture that we're working in, change the expectations, and have a bit of a kind of mind shift, and just be more gentle with ourselves, actually, in terms of what we're expecting. So that's my kind of myth busting, but it doesn't mean that we just give up and go home, because we do know quite a lot of stuff, actually. And more worrying than the myths, to me, is how much we know and how much we still get wrong. Okay, so if we actually acted on what we knew, we'd be a whole lot further than we are now, notwithstanding these myths. So let me just push on a little bit to talk to you about some of these things. Now, I know we've got international people, so apologies, I'm going to talk about kind of UK context, but you will no doubt have very similar parallels in your own situations. So in the UK, we've got something called the UK Foresight Team, clues in the name. They operate as part of the Office for Science. And again, the reference to them and to their work is on the very last slide, and Andrea will send those to you afterwards, so you'll be able to have a look at it. They've now been working for 25 years, and this is lifted straight off their website. So I'm not affiliated to them in any way, but I do think they're brilliant. So this is a kind of little ad for them. They, as it says, have been working for 25 years now, using scientific evidence to help inform policymakers, okay? And they look at the big global trends. They're part of our civil service, so they're not political, and they produce reports on the kind of big themes. So obesity, city-led initiatives, you can see there the future of food and farming, or the future of the sea, these kind of really big themes, thematic reviews, and foresight. And they produce quite a lot of really, really brilliant, excellent resources that you can find online, and I would encourage you to do so. And when you start to read those, you realize, goodness, we know quite a lot of stuff. So somebody's mentioned in the chat already about AI. They have done a brilliant foresight report about not just AI as a thing, but really quite specifically about what does AI in the future mean for public policy makers. So if any of you are working on public policy and you know that AI is a thing, but you don't quite know how to translate that into the work that you're doing, look up that report. It's brilliant. Equally, the 5 ways to well-being and the what works centres that work there. I've talked about that before on my evidence webinar. I'm always amazed when I mention these things, how little they are known within the policymaking community. We know a lot of stuff. We've got some really brilliant people producing really excellent reports. And there's something about this pace of frenetic activity and the level of demand and the failure to take a step back sometimes means we don't have the time to read the good information that's out there. So there is a lot of good stuff that we know. I'm going to dig a little bit more into what we know specifically to illustrate the point about what actually goes wrong when we think about trying to future-proof, because I think the biggest thing is culture. So what we do know, we in the UK, we have a system, and we have a national risk register. We've had it for many years, but it's been published since 2008, and you can go back through the archives and have a look at what we've been allegedly planning for all this time. The risk themes, and again, most countries have an equivalent. How well they are published and whether you can access them is something that differs quite a lot internationally, but certainly in the UK we've been publishing them since 2008, although not since 2017, so we can infer why they haven't been published for the last 3 years. The big themes in our national risk register: natural hazards, diseases, major accidents, societal risk, and malicious attacks. Oh, great question, thank you. I will come to that when in the Q&A. So we've got these themes that we look at, and if you look at as I have done, if you look at the risk register as they've been published between 2008 and 2017, one of the things that they include in the forward of each risk register is noticeable changes, things that are significantly increasing, that are new threats. And in 2017, number 1 on our increasing risk was emerging infectious diseases. Number 2, cyber attacks. Number 3, antimicrobial resistance. And here, remember what Patrick Dixon was saying about the intersection of trends. This is exactly what our 2017 report says in the UK, that there is a significant risk where we have emerging infectious diseases that won't respond to the kind of treatments that we've got, where we have novel diseases that will transmit through a population that will be a challenge to treat, frankly, plus cyber attacks and climate change. So what do we know? Now, this risk register is from 2007. They changed the way the UK every year, they seem to change the way that they portray the risk register, which is a bit irritating. This is much easier on the eye. The more up-to-date one is it's not formatted in such a nice way. But what I wanted to show you the old one, because look, pandemic influenza, the most significant threat since 2007. You can go through the risk registers. We have literally been preparing for this and rehearsing for this for more than a decade.
Wow.
And yet everybody says, oh, it's unprecedented, it's unexpected. It's really not. So again, I don't want to make this about COVID because I don't think that's helpful. But what I did think was interesting is, yes, we know all those myths are true. We can't predict the future. We don't know what's coming. But there are some things we do know. There are some things we can predict. We've got quite a rigorous and robust system for doing just that. And when you look at our risk register, what are the things that we know about? Pandemic influenza, coastal flooding, attacks on crowded places. These are things that are all, certainly in the UK, very much in the news right now as allegedly unexpected, unprecedented things that we are struggling to respond to. So I think as part of this kind of myth busting theme, another thing that I think we really need to grapple with is, how do we know all this stuff and still seem to fail at being ready for it? What is it that's going on? Now, I don't have a complete answer for this. I literally made some stuff up when I put the slides together, but it's a thing that has really been exercising my mind recently, because it's not enough to know and predict stuff. And I think maybe that's another myth, that if we know and predict things, then that's the end of the story. I don't think it is. I think there needs to be action taken afterwards. So why we still fail. You may recognize on the slide there is the black swan. Some of you will have heard of that as a theory, kind of black swan theory. This idea that in England, at least, kind of in the 18th and 19th century, a black swan was used as a phrase, a bit like we use unicorn now. A black swan was this idea of completely mythical, impossible thing that would just never exist. And then, of course, when people left these shores and went elsewhere, they realized that, yes, black swans do exist. And then we came upon this theory that a thing that we think is impossible suddenly makes sense when we see it for real, when we confront the reality of it. So black swan kind of wraps up a lot of why we fail. And I want to suggest these what have I got, 5 things why we fail. And I'm going to talk then about 5 things that kind of match those, about how we might react and respond to some of that. And then let's get stuck in some of these questions. Thank you for posting them. Lack of strategic planning. So we've got a question about this already. A lack of strategic planning. We still fail because even though we have these little niche units producing these wonderful reports and publishing them and making them available, most of us actually doing the work, frankly, don't know they exist. And if we do, we haven't got time to read them. There is a real lack of strategic planning because the now overwhelms us. There's also what I've called the appeal of novelty. There is an absolute failure, at least in the UK system, maybe it's better elsewhere, to learn from what we've done before. We seem to disregard the learning from the past. I have been really quite frustrated recently because in the UK, at the moment, there is a real drive for regional locations of central Whitehall departments. There's this real push. There's a lot of lovely people, but they're kind of quite young graduates, and I realize I sound like an old person as I say this. Lots of our current brightest and best graduates are working on developing a regional hub program. Okay, and they talk about, oh, it's going to be amazing, we're going to relocate central Whitehall departments to the regions. The regional government structure in the UK was only abolished in 2010. So up until 2010, we had exactly what they are talking about creating right now. And I heard on the news just last week, and I was one of those irate people that had to get in contact, and I had a moment of fame as my name was read out on the radio. Somebody on the radio said, well, the problem with this is we would never have regional ministers. The whole time ministers want to stay in Whitehall, this regional government structure could never be a thing. I worked for a regional minister who had a regional private office based in the regions. That was only 12 years ago. And yet we have completely forgotten, our institution has completely forgotten that these things existed, and people are now reinventing them like they're a brand new thing. And this we replicate across, 12 years is not a long time when you're thinking about a strategic plan that should endure for 50 years. If we can't actually remember what we did as an institution 10 years ago, because suddenly the new thing is the best thing, these things are really, really problematic. Just having a look. Thank you. Prime Minister should watch my webinar, please. If we want to make that as the recommendation, let's do it. If he finds 10 minutes.
We just need his email address. We can post that to him, no problem.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll just hack into one of you who are good at cyber. You can hack into the Number 10 website and put it on there. What else? Psychological biases. Now, this is really interesting, and we haven't got time for this. This is a whole kind of behavioral insight stuff. But there's something about the way our human brain works. There is a behavioral insight subgroup of SAGE working in the UK, and their reports are so interesting. We are unable to comprehend things that we don't know, and there's something particularly around exponential growth that the human brain just can't understand. Okay, so one of the things is we are, even though we have the information, even though we have the data, even where future things are guaranteed, we just can't seem to process it in our minds. And we've seen this. If there was one thing that's causing a lot of the problems right now, I think it's this, that people don't understand that there is a problem, even though hospital numbers for COVID are quite low at the moment, because they say, well, there's only 40, yeah, but if it's doubling every day, in 2 weeks it will be, and you can know the numbers and you can see the graph, but there's something around the way that our brain processes information, our psychological biases, we just kind of can't comprehend it. You'll only have to look back till February, when the UK press was criticising what China was doing and saying we would never have a lockdown like that in the UK. It would just never happen. This inability to comprehend something that we haven't experienced really colours the way that we can take on information. What else? I call this a democratic lag. Now, this is really important, and this is really important kind of culturally. One of the reasons that democratic countries are slower to act is because they actually do have to take public opinion with them. And I don't want to, necessarily agree with Boris Johnson here, but we do need to take public opinion with us. In liberal democracies, we don't have the facility to force compliance. Okay, we don't have a military that can lock people up in the streets. We don't have enough police to arrest everybody. We have to have a consensus in order to enforce anything. And it takes time to build consensus at a population level. So to take COVID, had we just announced a lockdown before people were psychologically prepared to do it, if as a population everyone had just decided not to do it, there really is very little that the government can do to force compliance at a population level in our system and in most liberal democracies. So when we are reliant on consensus, taking the kind of decisive action that's sometimes required is actually quite tricky. So there is a reason why the more autocratic systems can act more quickly. And actually there's something in that that's quite important and kind of cultural. There's also something here about, we talk about, Michael Barber talks about the need for ruthless prioritization in political situations. That's quite hard if what you're ruthlessly prioritizing is the opinions of people. So that there's a real issue there. I'm going to speed up. The other thing I think that's a problem is that our experts are isolated. We put them in a committee. They're not integrated into the policy making process. So there's a whole load of good stuff that we know, but it doesn't get incorporated. So what are we going to do about it? And then let's take some questions. Brilliant. I think we do need to invest in the strategic function in public sector organizations. I teach separately and speak separately about how we can integrate the incident command model of strategic thinking into our business as usual. I think we need to think about how we embed realistic expectations into our decision-making and policy frameworks. I would encourage you to have a look at the Futures Toolkit from the Office for Science, particularly scenario planning. We do it very well in the UK for our long-term infrastructure projects. We can do more of that elsewhere. We need to be better at translating evidence into the policy space, and I've done a whole webinar on that, but if you missed that, you can catch up on it. Have a look at the What Works Centre. I think we need a skills-led response. We need to train people up, and this isn't just a plug for training, but taking time to do the training is really important. But in terms of strategic thinking and futures, stuff around collaboration, negotiation, resilience, systems and strategic thinking are all really important skills, and we need to take the time to develop those right the way across our public sectors. And then I haven't got an answer for this one, but if we haven't got public trust and clear communication from government, I think we are never going to get to where we need to be.
We're in trouble.
So there we go. The last slide is just a whole lot of references, so you'll get that when you get the slide pack. So Andrea, do you want to just give us a little bit of a review
if you just want to do you want to move on to the references slide now? Just if anyone on there that wants to note anything down. Again, we will be sending these slides via PDF to you all, so don't worry, you don't have to write something down at the speed of light. We will be sending a copy of these to you, but this is just just going back to what Claire was talking about earlier in relation to the references and the books and the links and things like that. Claire, if you just want to go to the next slide, please. So please do use the Q&A box to our participants. Please feel free to use that now if you do have any questions, but there are a couple of questions that were pinged to us earlier on. There's no name on this one, but how do you persuade your stakeholders if they see the future differently from you? So
I think that's so interesting. And I think, you know, one of the skills that I talked about when I identified the need for a skills-led response is collaboration. And I think, you know, our stakeholders should be part of our systems and part of our solutions. So I think to answer a question with another question, I think, how do we create a vision of the future together with our stakeholders? How do we share a process of imagining or reimagining or shaping the future? How do we share the evidence that we've got? How do we incorporate that with some ethnographic research or user data? How do we bring our stakeholders along on the journey? And again, when we've talked about policy making and we've talked about the kind of policy cycle, how can we involve our stakeholders early in the process? And for me, it's the whole time government is a thing that just broadcasts information to people or does things to people. I think we're really set up to fail. So for me, a lot about the trust, about the communication, about the collaboration, particularly if we're going to be realistic and say that there's a diminishing importance about the kind of the function of the nation state. There's this kind of global tribal. And if our stakeholders actually are the tribes, maybe they own more of the policy space than we do. So we need to find ways to collaborate, change our mindset.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much for your question, whoever that was, and thank you for answering that, Claire. There's just a couple of comments as well. Trevor's just left a comment. It's not really a question, but it's good to just to look at that. On public trust, he agrees how crucial this is and how governments and senior figures model this. Some good evidence from COVID tracking studies that incidents like the Dominic Cummings episode had a significant impact on public trust and desire to comply with restrictions. So yes, thank you for that comment, Trevor. So another question.
I would agree. Yeah. And I would also, at the risk of becoming too political, you know that when my teenage son uses, when I'm trying to get him to do a thing claiming that he hasn't, when he's telling me that he has, but only in a limited and specific way, when the language of government breaking international law breaks into teenage arguments in households, you know that this stuff matters.
Yeah.
That what we see modelled by our leaders does affect this. And when, particularly as I've said, when we require consensus for compliance, it's so important. It's not as meaningless as we think it is. It really, really does matter.
Yeah. Thank you for that comment. Okay, so A. McGinty has left a question in the Q&A box. How can we integrate, make time for the strategic planning in day-to-day work rather than it being seen as a central detached function?
Yeah. You just kind of have to make a decision to do it. And I know that's not the silver bullet that you want to hear. It doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen by accident. Basically, you know, it's like anything. It's like diet, it's like exercise. Anything that you know, I know I have to do it, but I'll do it tomorrow. It won't ever happen unless you physically, intentionally put a time in your diary. So and you have to be quite sneaky and quite determined about it. I think I might have mentioned this on one of our other training sessions, but just to give you an example, when I was kind of middle ranking civil servant, we would have a weekly meeting of my peers, of my kind of team leader peers. Actually, it was only a monthly meeting, but what we used to do is we'd have the meeting room booked every week, and we would all go into it every week for an hour and a half. But 3 weeks out of 4, we would all be doing our own work. We'd be doing our strategic work, because we knew that if we put an hour aside for our own thing, it would get filled with something else. But if we were all in a room together, kind of conspiring that this was the plan, that we would make it. So, and this is a kind of part of my coaching practice. I coach senior leaders and strategic leaders. You really have to be very intentional make a decision. How are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? Put it in your diary, hold that space, guard that space, protect that space. And in the incident command methodology, this is gold command. This is a separate, a whole separate building from the now, that we have to be quite determined about. In the incident command legislation, it's actually set up as a separate thing, because we know if you put the senior leaders in the same place as the event, they won't do the planning. So that's why our gold command centers are normally in hotels or command centers and so on. So it has to be it's an act of discipline, actually, which is very unattractive. As anyone who's ever tried to train for a marathon or lose any weight knows, that the actual answer is you kind of just have to do it. You have to decide that it's important and make it happen.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you for the questions. And there's just a couple of comments that are coming through. Would it still work as well as we all meet remotely? Sorry, so would it still work as we all meet remotely? Question from Chris.
I think in terms of the strategic planning, you can still have strategic meetings. One of the things that I'm quite interested in when I work with organizations is they will often have a strategic board, and I will be quite rigorous with them about what is on the agenda on the strategic board. What are you discussing in your strategic meetings? And what you find is a lot of the time is taken up by the other stuff. So when you have a strategic meeting and online, you may well have your strategic board meeting happening every Monday morning or whatever it is. Is the stuff that they discuss actually the strategic stuff? Because frankly, if they're discussing the stuff that happened yesterday or today, that should be on the agenda for another meeting. We really should be looking future kind of facing, commissioning, taking reports, not responding so much to the now. So yeah, it can completely work. But again, it's about being quite rigorous and quite disciplined with the purpose and the agenda. And one of the things that you might find helpful is looking at that little diagram, the strategy, policy, delivery, and being really clear about which meeting am I in now, what's this for, what's this time for. Some of the people I work with have color coded the different parts of their diary or the different times of their day, and just try and be rigorous. Like, now is the bit I'm thinking about the future. I'm going to do today this afternoon. It's not very exciting or miraculous, but it does work.
Brilliant, fantastic. Well, thank you all for your questions. If you do have any further questions, I know that it's a lot of information to take in, but if you do come away from today's session and you have any questions for Claire, I've just popped my email address into the chat box. Please do feel free to contact me directly, and I'll liaise with Claire and we'll get those answers to you. Claire, could you just please go to the next slide, please? That would be fantastic.
Yeah, and as I do that, I'm just going to take the opportunity to say thank you so much. It's been really interesting. I've loved
you've got that
with these. Well, you can say it as well in a minute, but yeah, lovely questions, lovely interaction. I know these are not easy times. I know you're going to be under a lot of pressure. I hope that some of this has been reassuring, actually, that often it's not you doing a bad job, it's the situation and the expectations. And I hope that a little bit of honesty and reality will reassure you and hopefully start to give you some tools and signals about how you can make a step forward in your policy work. So
thank you very much. And yeah, those questions were fantastic to those who asked those. So thank you. So just quickly, a couple of last things before we say goodbye. More webinar news to keep up to date with our weekly webinars and to find out more information about what's coming up in the next month or two. Please do sign up to our training alerts at www.civilservicecollege.org.uk and visit our website and have a look on there to see what is coming up. Claire, if you could just go to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So our next webinar is actually taking place on Thursday, the 19th of November, and that will be on, is there a business case for equality, diversity and inclusion? And that will be with our guest speaker, Meenakshi Mistry, which will be on the 19th of November. So if you want to find out more information, read upon the webinar description, please do go on our website and have a little look on there. If you could just go to the next slide, please, Claire, thank you. Brilliant, thank you. And as always, just as a reminder, please do stay connected with us to find out what is actually going on behind the scenes at the college, what projects we're working on, and what training sessions are coming up, and of course, what webinars we are running each week. Our social media handle is @CSCollegeOrg. We are on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. This video will be posted on YouTube along with the PDF slides, which will be posted on our website and sent to you as well. So please do let your contacts, your colleagues, friends and family know who couldn't make today that it will be on YouTube, hopefully by the end of this week. And I just want to say thank you so much again, Claire. As always, it's been a massive pleasure. Third one down, hopefully we'll get you back on at some point early next year, if you're not sick of us, that is, of course.
Yeah, find something else interesting to talk about when we'll be there.
Oh, no, thank you. And I just want to say thank you to our participants as well. As Claire mentioned, obviously, as we all know, it is the first day of our second lockdown. So please do stay safe and keep your mind ticking. And yeah, we'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Thank you. See you later, Claire. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.